The courtroom freezes the moment he walks in, a young man dressed in designer clothes, chin high, smirk unshakable. The charges against him are serious, but he laughs. Actually laughs as they're read aloud. Gasps ripple through the room. A mother in the back looks away, embarrassed. The prosecutor stiffens. And Judge Caprio? He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't slam the gavel. He simply watches, calm, steady, unreadable. But then the millionaire's son pushes one step too far, and the entire courtroom senses it. Is this confidence, arrogance, or the beginning of a dramatic collapse everyone will remember? The tension settled over the courtroom like a thin, cold veil. Every whisper died as the young man leaned back in his chair. He wore a crooked smile that didn't match the seriousness of the charges. Judge Caprio watched him with steady, unreadable eyes. That smile widened, almost daring the room to react. People shifted, sensing something was already off. The first spark flickered before anyone spoke. It felt like arrogance warming up for impact. The prosecutor began, voice firm and practiced. Reckless driving, disrespecting an officer, a long-ignored fine. Each charge echoed through the room like a warning bell. The defendant stretched his arms, unimpressed, unfazed. He smirked as if the words were entertainment. Then he laughed, soft at first, then careless. The sound sliced through the air and people stiffened. A woman in the second row shook her head. An officer glanced at the bench, awaiting direction. Judge Caprio didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't rush. His silence grew heavier than any rebuke. The defendant's smile faltered for a heartbeat. Not gone, but threatened. The judge folded his hands, the movement slow and deliberate. The room leaned in, aware something meaningful was brewing. Authority didn't need volume here, it needed presence. And his presence filled every corner. Even the lights seemed to dim around the tension he controlled. Viewers watching would feel the shift instantly. He finally spoke, voice soft enough to demand stillness. He asked the young man whether the charges amused him. The defendant shrugged, the smile returning like a shield. A murmur rolled through the audience, half disbelief, half irritation. Caprio paused again, letting the weight of the moment expand. His eyes held the young man in place more than any officer could. Power met pride under the fluorescent glow. Another tiny crack appeared in the defendant's confidence. Caprio leaned forward, closing the emotional distance. He asked why a man would laugh at his own charges. The defendant hesitated, confidence flickering like a faulty light. Eyes across the room locked on him, waiting. His smile weakened, trembling at its edges. Moments like this remind viewers that respect matters. What would you do if someone laughed at their own charges? The shift had begun, and all felt it. The young man settled deeper into his chair, shoulders loose, chin lifted just enough to signal he'd been here before, and walked out untouched. His posture alone told a story. He tapped one foot, not nervously, but impatiently, as if the courtroom owed him time. His eyes swept the room with casual boredom. People recognized the look immediately. It was the expression of someone raised behind gates, coached by lawyers, protected by a last name that carried weight in the city. A whisper traveled through the rows. Someone murmured the name of his father, a millionaire whose company sponsored half the summer events downtown. Heads tilted. A few exchanged knowing glances. Entitlement didn't need introduction. It announced itself the moment he walked in. The prosecutor noticed too. She straightened her papers with a sharper motion than before, adjusting her rhythm as though preparing for a different kind of opponent, one who believed the rules were optional. She presented the first piece of evidence, dashcam footage of the reckless turn that nearly clipped a pedestrian. The screen flickered, and the young man barely glanced at it. He smirked again, jaw tightening with practiced confidence. It was the kind of smile that said, "My father has fixed worse." A few gasps rippled across the room. Someone whispered that he'd walked away from 3 previous incidents without consequence. The tension rose like heat off pavement. Judge Caprio listened without shifting in his seat. His face remained calm, unreadable, almost serene. Yet beneath that stillness was something building, a subtle tightening in his gaze, a growing weight in the pauses between breaths. He saw entitlement for what it was, and he owned the silence that made it crumble. The prosecutor continued, voice firm. She described the defendant's disregard for officers, the arrogance documented in the report, the unpaid fine he brushed aside for months. With every detail, the pressure in the room thickened. The young man rolled his neck, exhaled loudly, and shrugged as if the entire proceeding inconvenienced him. That single gesture deepened the divide between privilege and justice. Viewers watching moments like these have seen it before, someone believing wealth rewrites consequence. But in this courtroom, that belief was about to collide with a judge who treated every person the same. The anticipation grew with every second of the judge's quiet study of the defendant's face. Would the shield of money hold? Or finally crack? Does wealth excuse behavior? Comment below. The lights dimmed slightly as the prosecutor stepped forward and requested the dashcam footage. A hush rolled across the courtroom, a slow, tightening breath that made every seat feel smaller. The young man who had walked in with a swagger shifted just enough to betray unease. His smile still hovered, but it trembled like a flame exposed to a sudden wind. Then the screen flickered, and the footage began with a sharp crackle of police radio static. The defendant's voice erupted from the speakers, loud, mocking, dripping with a confidence that now felt poisonous. "Relax, man, my dad will handle this," he said in the video, waving dismissively at the officer. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, fast and sharp, the kind that carried judgment more than surprise. The defendant's real-time smirk faltered as his own recorded laughter filled the room like an accusation. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, as if he hoped the footage would somehow skip the worst parts. But it didn't. The video showed him bragging, pacing, boasting about influence, privilege, and how nothing's gonna happen. Every word echoed louder inside the heavy silence, reflecting off walls that had heard thousands of excuses. The audience shifted, a wave of murmurs rising like a storm building beneath polished floors. Even the officers in the back exchanged glances that blended disappointment with a quiet sense of vindication. The prosecutor stayed focused, letting the footage speak with more force than any argument she could offer. The young man swallowed hard, the first visible crack in the armor he had worn so confidently. His jaw tightened, his hands clasped together, no longer relaxed, no longer amused by his own bravado. The clip continued, capturing him laughing directly at the officer who had pulled him over that night. The arrogance felt heavier now, exposed and undeniable, stripped of charm and drowned in cold accountability. When the final frame froze on the screen, the room fell into a silence so absolute it stung. All eyes drifted to Judge Caprio, who hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, and hadn't lost an ounce of composure. His stillness carried more force than a shout, a calm waiting for the defendant to recognize the gravity. The young man finally looked up, searching the judge's expression for any sign of leniency or escape. He found none. Instead, he found a gaze that mirrored truth back at him, stripped of wealth, privilege, or illusions. The silence after the footage ended felt heavier than the evidence itself. The young man stared at the frozen frame on the screen, his confidence draining in thin, uneven breaths. Then, with a slow exhale that carried decades of wisdom, Judge Caprio finally broke the quiet. "Why were you laughing?" The question wasn't loud. It didn't need power behind it. The softness alone sliced straight through whatever composure the young man had left. He blinked, caught off guard. His mouth opened, but no sound came. A murmur swept across the courtroom, like everyone had just leaned in at once. The judge continued, steady and unshaken. "What part of this situation," he asked, "did you find amusing?" The young man swallowed, shoulders tightening as if the room itself pressed down on him. I wasn't really laughing at the officer," he murmured. "It was just... I don't know. I didn't mean anything by it." Another soft blow. "You didn't mean anything," the judge repeated, voice smooth as glass. "So the disrespect we all heard, that wasn't you?" The defendant shifted. His posture, once relaxed and arrogant, now folded inward. I wasn't thinking clearly." "You were laughing," the judge said, "while being stopped for dangerous behavior that could have hurt someone. You were laughing at a person trying to do his job. Does that seem amusing to you now?" Gasps whispered from the gallery. Even the officers stood taller, watching the unraveling with measured breaths. The young man's bravado, once loud and untouchable, now trembled in the open air. "No, sir," he said, voice breaking just slightly. The judge nodded slowly, as though giving the weight of those 2 words time to settle. "You know," he said, "I've seen many people in this courtroom. Some scared, some angry, some sorry. But very few laugh at the possibility of hurting someone. Very few laugh at responsibility." The defendant's eyes lowered. "I wasn't trying to be disrespectful." "But you were," the judge replied gently. "And the hardest part of growing up is learning to admit when you've been wrong." A pause. The kind of pause that forces truth to bloom in silence. The young man finally whispered, "I get that, now." The shift was visible. Arrogance melting into something quieter, something human. The courtroom felt the change, a collective breath easing. Have you ever seen arrogance melt this fast? The judge had just begun outlining the seriousness of the charges when the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Every head turned. Every whisper froze mid-air. The defendant's father stepped inside, tailored suit, commanding presence, the kind of man whose name alone could quiet an entire boardroom. But here, his power didn't follow him. Here, he looked shaken. The son snapped upright, spine straight, eyes widening as if salvation had walked in. But salvation wasn't smiling. The father's face carried something no wealth could soften, disappointment so sharp it cut the air. The murmurs began instantly, hushed but electric. "That's him. The millionaire. Maybe he'll fix it." The tension climbed so fast it felt like the room inhaled all at once. The father walked slowly down the aisle, each step echoing louder than the last, a reminder that even giants can be brought into rooms where money means nothing. Judge Caprio paused, hands folded calmly, gaze steady. He offered a respectful nod. "Good morning, sir." The father nodded back, voice low. "Your Honor." The judge lifted a hand gently. "This is your son's hearing." Those words landed with a force nothing dramatic had said before. The son's eyes flickered, as if hoping his father might still take control somehow. But the judge's tone allowed no misinterpretation. This moment belonged to the young man. Not his bank account. Not his last name. Not the legacy he had leaned on his entire life. The father exhaled, shoulders dropping slightly, a surrender not to the court, but to reality. He took a seat behind his son. The boy didn't turn around, but every muscle betrayed the truth. He felt his father's judgment more than the court's. Judge Caprio continued, his voice calm but edged with moral weight. "Your actions could have hurt someone," he said to the defendant. "Laughing at an officer doing his job. This isn't a game." Then he glanced briefly at the father. "And I imagine this is not how your family raised you." The father's jaw tightened, eyes glassy with a mix of anger, guilt, and heartbreak. The son's confidence collapsed completely. His breathing changed, shallow, uneven. For the first time, fear replaced arrogance. He whispered, barely audible, "Dad, I'm sorry." The father didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was the loudest punishment in the room. And you, yes, you watching, what would you say to your child in this moment? The room felt different now, heavier, quieter, as if everyone sensed the next part wasn't about law, but truth. Judge Caprio leaned forward, fingers gently interlaced, eyes steady on the young man whose posture had shrunk from arrogance into something closer to a wounded shadow. "Let me ask you something," he began softly. "Why do you feel untouchable? Why does it seem like nothing can happen to you?" The defendant's throat tightened. He hesitated, glancing at his father, then back at the judge. I don't know," he muttered. But the judge waited. And silence has a way of pulling honesty out of a person. Finally, the young man exhaled. "I grew up hearing I had to be the best. That I couldn't mess up. That I had to be strong all the time." His voice trembled. "And when I did screw up, someone always fixed it. My dad. His people. Friends. Everyone." A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom, the sound of understanding mixing with disbelief. "So you believed consequences weren't meant for you," the judge said, not accusing, simply reflecting. The young man nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I did." He swallowed hard, continuing despite the sting in his voice. My dad was barely around growing up. He always said it was for the family. For the business. But, I don't know. I just started doing whatever got attention. Whatever made people laugh. Made me feel big. A flicker passed across the father's face, anger melting into something far more painful. Recognition. The young man's eyes dropped. My friends, they hyped me up. Made me think it was cool to act like nothing mattered. That laws were for other people. The judge listened quietly, expression unreadable. But his stillness spoke volumes. Patience, not pity. Understanding, not forgiveness. So all that laughing, Caprio said softly, all that bravado, it wasn't confidence. It was armor. The defendant's breathing wavered. Yeah, I guess it was. A wave of empathy swept the courtroom, not enough to erase what he'd done, but enough to remind everyone that arrogance always has roots, and sometimes those roots are pain. For the first time, the young man turned toward his father. Their eyes met, no speeches, no justification, just years of missed moments hanging between them. The father's expression shifted again, from disappointment to realization. Layers were falling away, one by one. And now, justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about truth finally stepping into the light. The courtroom settles into a heavy quiet as Judge Caprio leans forward, his eyes fixed on the young man standing before him. The arrogance that once shielded the defendant has thinned, replaced by a trembling uncertainty. A few spectators exchange glances, sensing something different coming, a moment that feels larger than charges or fines. You know, the judge begins, voice low, steady, life has a strange way of giving us warnings before it gives us consequences. The words float through the room like a quiet bell. You've been given more chances than most people ever get. Yet you've treated every one of them like a free pass. The defendant swallows hard. I didn't mean. You did, the judge interrupts, calm but immovable. You meant every choice you made. But meaning a choice doesn't make you beyond redemption. A murmur spreads through the courtroom. Even the officers shift slightly, listening. You grew up thinking rules bend for you, Caprio continues. But let me tell you something. Privilege is not protection. It's responsibility. And when you misuse it, you don't just embarrass yourself, you hurt the people who believed in you. The father in the back exhales shakily, eyes glassy. The judge's tone softens, almost fatherly. There's a young man inside you who's scared. Scared to fail. Scared to be ordinary. Scared to admit he's been wrong. But courage is not pretending to be invincible. Courage is standing still long enough to face the truth. The defendant's voice cracks. I messed up. Caprio nods slowly. Yes. And that acknowledgement is worth more than any fine I could give you. He lets the silence stretch, powerful and cinematic, the kind of silence that makes viewers lean closer to their screens. You want respect. Earn it. You want freedom. Deserve it. You want a future. Build it. No more excuses. No more armor. Just accountability. The defendant wipes his eyes, defeated yet strangely lighter. I'm sorry, for real this time. The judge holds his gaze. Good. That's where change starts. Not in punishment, but in honesty. A woman in the gallery whispers, he needed to hear that. Caprio leans back. I'm not here to break you. I'm here to wake you. Because I've seen what happens when young men like you keep running. And I don't want you becoming another story people shake their heads at. The defendant nods, fully humbled. For those watching, the judge adds gently, if you believe words like these matter, say it. Some truths need to be echoed. The courtroom watched quietly, feeling the weight of a turning point settling over the young man's life and uncertain path. The courtroom had been silent for what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed. All eyes were fixed on Judge Caprio, who rose slowly, the weight of the moment pressing into the room. The young man's shoulders slumped, not with defeat, but with a dawning realization that this was the moment he could no longer hide behind a smirk or his father's name. Today, the judge began, calm but resolute, you will face the consequences of your actions. But justice is not only punishment. It is also the chance to become better than yesterday. His gaze swept the room, landing finally on the defendant. You will complete community service, participate in mandatory driving safety courses, and apologize personally to the officers you mocked. Every step of this path requires sincerity. Every moment demands reflection. The young man's hands trembled slightly. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, voice low but honest, no trace of sarcasm. The courtroom exhaled collectively, some faces softened with relief, others with admiration. Even the officers who had endured his earlier defiance watched carefully, seeing respect replace insolence. His father sat rigidly, eyes locked on his son. Relief mingled with humility. No words could convey the depth of what he felt, but in the quiet shift of expression, a nod, a tight exhale, the bond of accountability was acknowledged. Money, privilege, influence, none of it mattered now. The young man's growth had begun not in wealth, but in the courtroom's stillness, under the gaze of a man who demanded honesty, not fear. Caprio's voice carried again, a subtle moral hammer. "This is not the end. It is a beginning. A beginning defined by responsibility, by the courage to admit mistakes, and by the willingness to do what is right, even when it's hard. That is true strength. That is character." The defendant's eyes glistened. A small, genuine smile replaced the cocky grin that had once ignited whispers and gasps. He looked at the officers and his father, nodded once more, then sat down with a weight lifted yet a seriousness embedded deep in his posture. Transformation was visible, not only to those in the courtroom but to anyone witnessing the story unfold. The gavel struck sharply, finality ringing through the chamber. Silence followed, but it was the silence of understanding, of respect, of a lesson absorbed. For those watching, Judge Caprio had delivered more than a sentence. He had delivered a moment of awakening, a rare blend of justice and humanity. If you believe no one is above the law, and that growth can come from accountability, hit subscribe and carry this lesson with you.